All right, ladies and gentlemen, week 15 of the 2024 fantasy football season is in the books. So we're headed straight into week 16 of the season and into the second round of the fantasy playoffs. So you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, go over every single running back, and talk about who you should be starting and who you should be sitting. All right, let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We're going to have the Broncos traveling to face the Chargers, and this has got to be my least favorite matchup of the entire week when it comes to the running back position. Let's start with the Broncos side of things. Talk about a backfield that you absolutely cannot trust, a backfield that I've had as sits across the board for multiple weeks now. Javonte Williams, 4.3 fantasy points this past week. Audric Estime, 2.8 fantasy points. And then we have an injury to Jaleel McLaughlin, who had 6.4 fantasy points in this matchup. The touches are spread all over the place. The volume in the passing game on the ground is spread all over the place. Let's just stay away. It's a tough matchup against the Chargers, who I know didn't look good against the Buccaneers and their running attack, but nonetheless, there's nothing here except for deep league, extreme desperation plays. I don't want to start any Broncos running backs in the fantasy playoffs, period. And then we've got the Chargers side of things. Gus Bus this past week, 2.3 fantasy points against the Buccaneers. Kamani Vidal had 4.2 fantasy points, and Hassan Haskins had 0 fantasy points. So there's just nothing here. Once again, we're seeing a split backfield between Gus Edwards and Kamani Vidal, the only running back on this team who's had any fantasy relevancy on the season is J.K. Dobbins, who is still on IR. Nonetheless, two good run defenses between the Broncos and the Chargers, and two backfields that we want to completely avoid going into week 16. All right, and we're going to be treated with two Saturday games this weekend. Let's start with the Texans, who will travel to face the Chiefs. And another matchup here, not so great when it comes to running back position, but we do have Joe Mixon, and I know he had a lower ceiling this past week in a game where the game script worked against him, but he still had 10.6 fantasy points, 12 touches, just 23 yards on the ground. Definitely not good there, but he did have 6 targets, 5 grabs, 33 receiving yards. Like I said, 10.6 fantasy points, so he is now giving you double digits in every full game he's played in on the season except for one in week 12. So not a great matchup here. Maybe look at your options, as the Texans will be traveling to Kansas City as well. We know that this run defense for the Chiefs is very stingy, and then he's got another tough task in week 17 against the Ravens. But I think you own Joe Mixon. You keep rolling with him. It's definitely going to depend on who you got, but I got a tough time benching Joe Mixon in the fantasy playoffs. And keep in mind, he did kind of have a little bit of an ankle issue this past week, but he seems to be fine and he should be good to go this week. But if anyone else pops up here, Darway Agumbawale, Damian Pierce, we want to stay away from these guys. Are just not fantasy relevant enough. So it's Mixon or nobody for me in this matchup. And then we look at the Chiefs and just, man, Kareem Hunt, 13 touches for 45 yards on the ground, 2 targets and a catch. Then Isaiah Pacheco, 13 touches, 32 yards on the ground, and 1 catch as well. 5.7 fantasy points to Pacheco, 5.9 to Hunt. I mean, it's a split backfield. It seems like they're struggling to get the run game going with Pacheco. They're going back to Hunt a little bit. The Texans have been pretty good against the run throughout the majority of the season. So I had both Chiefs running backs as a sit this past week and the week before, and I just don't know that Isaiah Pacheco is going to be a thing through the fantasy playoffs. I mean, Texans, tough matchup this week. The following week, they're on the road against Pittsburgh, and if you play through week 18, they're on the road against Denver. There's nothing here for me. I don't want to start any of these guys, and dare I say, Isaiah Pacheco, if you got tough choices to make on your roster, he might be a cut candidate, because I just don't think you're going to have the confidence to start him in these matchups to wrap up the season. And then on top of that, I mean, he's just not getting the production. He's 100% touchdown dependent for a good fantasy stat line. So I'm avoiding all Chiefs running backs going in to week 16. The second Saturday game is going to be the Steelers traveling to face the Ravens. Let's start with the Steelers side of things. Tough matchup this week for Najee Harris, who's coming off of a very bad performance in week 15 against the Philadelphia Eagles, where he had just 3.1 fantasy points. Absolutely disgusting for a player who, since week 6 had given you double digits in every game except for one. And I mean, pretty good ceilings too: 20.2, 16.2, 16.1, 24.9, then 3 games with in between 11 and 13 points. So Najee's been very good. I will say I was close to putting Najee a tier lower in that kind of start him if you need to category, because it's a tough matchup on the road. But what I'm more concerned about is the Steelers' offense as a whole. No George Pickens really impacting this team. I think the defense is going to take a huge hit with the injury to TJ Watt. We'll probably see more of the offense on the field. I guess that could be good from a fantasy perspective. But I mean, the Steelers team dealing with some big injuries right now. And I don't think Pickens is going to be good to go in week 16, but only time will tell, I suppose. Nonetheless, some of that momentum for this team slowing down a little bit, it seems. So I worry a little bit about Najee Harris due to the matchup here and the other factors, but I still think he's very startable. I don't want to read too much into last week, but would I be surprised if Najee Harris walks away with a similar stat line to last week? No. So make sure you guys look at your options and evaluate what you've got. But Najee still a top 20 running back on the season. I got Jaylen Warren as a sit because his ceiling's already been lowered, right? He's always a desperation play. If you got nothing, you need to throw somebody out there, grab him off the waiver wire. He is 76% rostered, but he's one of these players similar to Justice Hill, who we'll talk about in a minute, who can always give you some sort of fantasy value, but I just don't know that I want to start Warren going into this matchup against the Ravens. Now, speaking of running backs who had tough week 15s, Derrick Henry, his first single-digit performance on the season when he needed him the most. Wow. 6.7 fantasy points, 67 yards on the ground. I mean, he was pretty efficient, 4.79 yards per carry, but no touchdowns, no receiving work. And the Ravens came out, absolutely slaughtered the Giants, but they did a lot of that through the air, and they got a lot of their backup receivers involved and Mark Andrews involved. Lamar Jackson threw 5 total touchdowns. So it just wasn't a day where Derrick Henry was necessary. This is a bit of a tougher matchup this week against the Steelers. Definitely a tough matchup in general, but also a matchup in a game script that could lead to more involvement out of Derrick Henry. So I don't overthink this one. I'm leaving Derrick Henry as a start this week, but yeah, I would be lying if I wouldn't say I'm a little bit concerned because his rest of strength schedule is, rest of season schedule, is a little bit tough as well. Pittsburgh, Houston, and Cleveland if you play through week 18. So keep an eye on things here, but I'm still starting Derrick Henry if I got him. Now, Justice Hill did have a big week this past week, right? Essentially nothing on the ground, but 5 targets, 5 catches, 61 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. It's just so hard to call when Justice Hill is going to get that involvement, when he's going to be utilized, when we're going to see him actually score. But he's one of these players. I got him as a sit, but you can always start him if you're desperate for points. But just bear in mind, you're kind of playing with fire if Justice Hill is in your starting lineup in week 16. Moving along to Sunday's action, we're going to start with the Giants, who are traveling to face the Falcons. And who in the world really knows what Giants offense we're going to get? Are we going to get Tommy DeVito? Are we going to get Tim Boyle? Are we going to get Drew Lock? I don't know, but none of those quarterbacks really lead to great performances for Tyrone Tracy unless he's going up against a very soft run defense, right? Week 13 and week 14, Tracy was good, 14.5 or more fantasy points. Weeks 12, week 15, against tougher run defenses, bad fantasy performances. So it's just tough to say. I think Tracy's startable, but he's in a lower tier. I wouldn't go out of my way to start Tracy this weekend. For the most part, the Falcons have been good against the run on the season. So I think that this offense could be stifled a little bit if their quarterback play is lesser, and that's not a great matchup. So I'm not going out of my way to start Tracy. Now, Devin Singletary had a decent day this past week, had 13.1 fantasy points against the Ravens, but I mean, you take away the touchdown, he essentially did nothing except for 3 catches in this game. So I'm not I'm not starting Devin Singletary. No, thank you. And I'm not like jumping to the waiver wire to pick up Singletary just because he ended up outperforming Tracy this past week, so to speak, from a fantasy perspective. But just no thank you. I mean, you got to be very desperate to be starting a Giants running back in the second round of the fantasy playoffs, right? So I would avoid them at all costs. Now, as a reminder, I have to record these videos before Monday Night Football has been played. So if there's any major injury to Bijan Robinson or anything that for some reason would change my confidence level in him, then there'll be a pinned comment down below. But starting Bijan Robinson, no matter what, good matchup here against the Giants. You own Bijan. He's healthy. You roll with him the rest of the way. He's the one most consistent, brightest spot on this Falcons offense. Not that Drake London hasn't been that bad this year. Mooney's had his moments, but compared to Cousins and Pitts and all of that, Bijan's been absolutely fantastic. A top 10 running back on the season. Keep rolling with him. Algier, probably in that category, like you're absolutely desperate. You can always take a gamble, but I would not recommend doing so. I know he had a nice week 14 for what it was worth, but he's been so inconsistent, and he's nothing but a handcuff for me. So staying away from Algier in week 16. Moving along, we'll have the Patriots traveling to face the Bills. And, well, this could be an ugly one. We'll find out, I suppose, but it could be an okay one as well. Nonetheless, when it comes to Ramondre Stevenson, I think he is startable, and I will just leave it at that. I still think he's just in that desperation range. He had a nice day this past week on the ground, just didn't score or anything, 5.3 yards per carry off of 13 touches, but his upside continues to be capped because since Drake May has taken over as quarterback, the Patriots want to throw first and foremost, and we just see less involvement to Stevenson. But it is a good matchup. The Bills have struggled against a run on the season, but I could also see the Bills coming out here and just absolutely in all areas of the game dominating the Patriots. So we'll see what happens, but he's startable. I could also see him being game scripted out. Good luck if you own Stevenson and you have to start him. I'll just leave it at that. Antonio Gibson is a sit for me. 8.4 points this past week, I guess, was better than I expected, but I have no interest in wanting to start Gibson in week 16. James Cook, we left as a start this past week, coming off of a bad performance in week 14. And even in a tough matchup on the road, absolutely showed up. Had 105 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns, 1 catch for 28 receiving yards, 26.3 fantasy points. Top 10 running back in fantasy this year. I don't know how you bench James Cook. He's got to be a start in your lineup in week 16. Ray Davis did some things as well. Had a receiving touchdown, 10 fantasy points, but just really hard to call when Ray Davis is going to be a thing. Look at the last 4 weeks. 1.1 point, 13.7, 0, 10.9. So great handcuff, but yeah, I don't have enough confidence to start Ray Davis in week 16. Next up, we have the Cardinals, who are traveling to face the Panthers, and James Conner had a huge week in week 15. He's had a fantastic fantasy season, single digits just 3 times on the season. And like I said, this past week, 110 yards on the ground, 6.8 yards per carry, his highest mark in that category on the season. 2 rushing touchdowns, 5 targets, 5 catches, 28 receiving yards, 30.8 fantasy points. And this week, he gets the Panthers, who have been god-awful against the run all season long. Don't need to break this one down. James Conner's an absolute must start in week 16. He needs to be in your lineups. Trey Benson, Amari DeMarcado, anybody else here, just handcuffs. No reason to even go over them. Chuba Hubbard, still got him as a start, but a rough week this past week in a smash matchup against the Cowboys. Had just 10 carries for 32 rushing yards, 4 targets, 4 catches, and 17 receiving yards. And this was, the game where no Jonathan Brooks, right? There's nobody in terms of competition here, right? I mean, everybody's hurt on the Panthers roster at the running back position, except for Chuba. The game script just didn't help him. I got Miles Sanders' name on the screen, but, he's on IR. Dylan Johnson's hurt. Raheem Blackshear's hurt. And Jonathan Brooks is hurt. It's just Chuba Hubbard. And, even though the game script didn't help him, you would expect more against a bottom 5 run defense in the Dallas Cowboys. So very disappointing in a moment where you needed Chuba to come through for you and at least get you 10, 12 points. Did not happen. Still got him as a start this week, though. It's a good matchup at home, and I think he'll bounce back this week. So depends on who you got, but I think Chuba Hubbard's still a very strong start in week 16. You already know one of my favorite lines on Underdog here in week 16 has to be the over on James Conner's total rushing yards. Currently sitting at 77.5 rushing yards. He has smashed that in his last 2 games. And he's getting the Panthers' run defense this week, and we've done it all season long. We're looking for these lines for running backs against the Panthers' run defense. I think James Conner will absolutely smash this line. So I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on James Conner's total rushing yards. Don't forget, all new users who sign up using promo code TheCatch on Underdog are getting a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 16's action. Take that free Pick'em. Pair it with the over on Conner's rushing yards. Once both of those lines hit, you'll automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you guys sign up using promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So it's a free NFL Pick'em for Week 16 and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up using promo code TheCatch. Moving along, we'll have the Lions traveling to face the Bears. And let's start with the Lions. And man, probably one of the worst moments from this past Sunday came with the news that David Montgomery will miss the rest of the regular season. Rest of the fantasy season. Might be back for the real life playoffs. We'll find out. But, kind of explains the low performance in week 15, 5 touches on the ground, 4 rushing yards, 4 targets, 4 catches, 31 receiving yards, in a good matchup, in a competitive game script. It absolutely sucks because Monty's been so consistent this season, and he's going to be a drop. Can't roster him anymore, no reason to do so outside of Dynasty League. So definitely a bad weekend for David Montgomery owners. Good weekend, I suppose, for Jahmyr Gibbs owners because he's already a top 5 running back in fantasy. And now, we'll probably see some sort of volume go to Craig Reynolds. Maybe they'll sign somebody, bring somebody up from the practice squad. I would assume they're going to go into each game with 3 running backs, the way they run the football. But yeah, it's going to be all Jahmyr Gibbs moving forward, and he's going to absolutely smash for the rest of the fantasy playoffs. He had 28.4 fantasy points in week 15, 31 yards on the ground, a rushing touchdown, 5 catches for 83 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. He has double digits in every game on the season. So Gibbs start. Anybody else who joins Gibbs this weekend is just going to be a sit for me. And once again, I have to record these before Monday Night Football, so see what happens with the Bears running backs on Monday Night Football, but they got a tough matchup against the Vikings. You never know. It's another tough matchup this week against the Lions. It is a home game for the Bears, but, Swift's going into week 15 is questionable. Might get some touches to Travis Homer is the assumption, as Roschon Johnson is out with a concussion. And then you got Ian Wheeler on IR. So I don't feel very confident in this bunch going into week 15 or going into week 16. So if something changes my mind, it'll be in a pinned comment down below. Moving along, we'll have the Titans traveling to face the Colts. Let's start with the Titans side of things. Tony Pollard, 8.5 fantasy points this past week. Wasn't that bad. Wasn't super efficient, but he had 45 yards on the ground and a touchdown. Kind of the elephant in the room, though, was that Tajay Spears had a really big day. He had a rushing touchdown and a lot of receiving work. 7 targets, 6 grabs, 87 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. So this one's interesting. I don't exactly know how the split's going to look in week 16. And Tajay Spears didn't get a lot of involvement on the ground, just 4 touches, but he had that kind of Superman type touchdown. It was really still Tony Pollard's backfield. We just saw all the receiving work go to Tajay, and Tajay made the most of it. And Tony Pollard had a lost fumble in this game as well. So it's a mess. Is Will Levis going to start this week? Is Mason Rudolph going to start this week? What is this offense? What are they playing for? I don't know, but it's a pretty good matchup against the Colts. So Pollard, Spears are both very startable going into the week. But understand that we've got a bit of a split backfield here. An offense that's completely up in the air, but they get the Colts this week and the Jags the following week. These matchups on paper are pretty dang good. And speaking of the Colts, Jonathan Taylor, everybody pointing fingers at. Going into week 15, I liked Jonathan Taylor. I told you guys, I think if you own him, I mean, he had 17 fantasy points in his last start in week 13. I think you can start him, even a tough matchup on the road against the Broncos. And he was not that bad. 22 touches, 107 rushing yards, and 1 catch off of 2 targets. But yeah, he dropped the football at like the half-inch yard line, like as close as you could possibly drop the touchdown or drop the football before scoring a touchdown. And that probably left a sour taste in your mouth if you're a Jonathan Taylor owner. But if he had scored, he would have had like 16, 17 fantasy points again. So super tough, super annoying, changed the entire game, right? But it is a good matchup this week against the Titans, who have not been great against the run. JT was still pretty dang good this past week, still had 10 fantasy points. So I'm leaving him in the start category, and let's just hope he doesn't drop any footballs right before he scores this week. But he should have opportunity. And don't forget, the Colts are not out of the playoff picture, so they're going to be doing whatever they can to come out here and absolutely dominate the Titans on all sides of the football. So I do like Jonathan Taylor this week. Let's just try and forget about week 15. Moving along, let's take a look at the Rams, who are traveling to face the Jets. Two very interesting backfields. Let's start with the Rams, who these are one of these teams. They're top of their division right now, but they are still in absolute win now territory as they have not secured that division, right? So they're going to be coming out here and they're going to be putting that, their foot on the gas, doing whatever they can to beat the Jets. Kyren Williams was solid this past week, and the worst game of the week on Thursday Night Football between the Rams and the Niners, but he had 108 yards on the ground, 2 catches, 13.2 fantasy points. Kyren has given you 1 single-digit performance on the whole season. You got to keep rolling with Kyren Williams if you own him. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Did I say that right? Regardless, start Kyren Williams, right? Blake Corum's just a handcuff. That's it. Nothing else. Okay, so that one's pretty simple. But, man, what in the world do we do with the Jets' backfield? Breece Hall did play in Week 15 against the Jags. He had 13.1 fantasy points, 30 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 2 catches for 21 receiving yards. Braylon Allen suffered a back injury. May or may not play this week. Isaiah Davis, 3.6 fantasy points. So Davis had 5 touches and 1 target, 1 catch. So Breece Hall out-touched Davis, but not by much. And the Jets did a lot offensively. So I don't know what to make of this team. They're definitely not going to roll over anytime soon, which is good from a fantasy perspective. It looks like Aaron Rodgers just wants to go out there and have some fun and sling some touchdowns to Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson. And I don't know. They're not playing for anything, but I guess Aaron Rodgers' pride. So Breece Hall plays in Week 16. It's not the best, not the worst matchup against the Rams, but if he's healthy, good to go. Keep rolling with him. Anybody else here I'm just going to have as a sit. They're back to kind of handcuff territory as long as Breece Hall is playing. So we got Kyren, we got Breece. Let's roll with them in Week 16. Next up, we have the Eagles traveling to face the Commanders in a little divisional matchup here. And Saquon Barkley coming off of a single-digit performance in a tough matchup against the Steelers. 19 touches, 65 yards on the ground, 2 targets, 2 catches, 9 receiving yards. Tough day to own Saquon Barkley, right? But you just got to erase it. You got to look at what he's done on the season as a whole. Single digits just 3 times. Been absolutely fantastic on the season. Your RB1 in fantasy football. This is a big game for the Eagles. Big game for the Commanders. Playoff implications both ways. You own Barkley. Just keep rolling with them. We did see a little bit more involvement out of Kenneth Gainwell this past week, but I'm not going to read too much into it. He's just a handcuff. Roll with Saquon Barkley. If you got him, don't think twice about it. Now, Brian Robinson Jr. was one of my must-start players this past week, and that game between the Commanders and the Saints turned out to be way more competitive than I thought, but also the matchup was so good. And B-Rob was like fine, but that's it. 11.7 fantasy points, 65 yards on the ground, 3 catches for 22 receiving yards, and completely outtouched Jeremy McNichols and Chris Rodriguez, who I thought may see more involvement due to the game script at hand, but did not happen. So Here in week 16 is a tough matchup against the Eagles. I still think Brian Robinson is startable, but it's going to depend on who else you got. I mean, this is a tough matchup. The Commanders are at home here, but this Eagles run defense is no joke. But like I said, the game script should be competitive. No matter what happens here, the Commanders will be playing till the very last snap of this game. So B-Rob is still startable, but just temper your expectations. We'll have to see how this one shakes out. Moving along, we got the Browns, who are traveling to face the Bengals. And Nick Chubb going to miss the rest of the season as he has a broken foot. Super unfortunate after he was able to bounce back from that gruesome injury last year and give us some production on the season. He is out for the remainder of the season. That's going to leave Jerome Ford as the next man up, who had 7 touches for 84 yards this past week, a rushing touchdown. I know it was on one big play and everything. Still did it. 2 catches for 20 receiving yards, 18.4 fantasy points against a good Chiefs run defense. And this week he gets the Bengals, a defense that I am not scared of, who they do rank relatively high against opposing running backs fantasy wise, but they still do not scare me at all. I think Jerome Ford is startable. He's kind of in the category because, like, what is this offense? Is Jameis Winston going to start? Is DTR going to start? How much are they going to throw the ball? Jerry Jeudy's been balling. Like, is David Njoku healthy? Is Cedric Tillman healthy? There's a lot of questions here. They're not playing for anything. Their season's over. They're just here to spoil the Bengals' playoffs hopes and dreams, which the Bengals have to win every single game on the rest of the season. So Jerome Ford's startable due to the matchup, and that's it. I would assume that Donta Foreman's going to be active this week, but him and Pierre Strong, just no thank you. Let's just stay away. Jerome Ford is enough. And he actually sits at 43% rostered, believe it or not. So I won't go past that. Chase Brown is fantastic. Is a must start every single week. 26.3 fantasy points this past week. 97 yards on the ground. A touchdown, 3 catches, 16 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Tough schedule to wrap up the season. Cleveland this week. Denver the following week, and if you play through week 18, then he gets Pittsburgh. So just bear that in mind, but there's no way that I'm going to tell you to sit Chase Brown, who's had 19 or more fantasy points every game since week 9. Still a must-start player. Anybody else on this roster at running back is going to be a sit in week 16. Next up, we got the Vikings, who are traveling to face the Seahawks, and this one is a little tough to evaluate because, once again, I have to record these before Monday Night Football. So anything major happens to Aaron Jones or if my opinion changes, it'll be in a pinned comment down below. But Seahawks defense this past week did nothing to make me fear them in terms of their run defense. Josh Jacobs literally, I think the Packers could have thrown the ball or handed the ball off to Josh Jacobs every play, and the Seahawks still would have not been able to stop it. So I'm good with Aaron Jones this week. We'll see what happens. Anybody else here? Cam Akers, Ty Chandler, just staying away from. But Jones, at worst, should give you a solid floor in week 16. Now, we don't know at the time of recording this if Kenneth Walker is going to be active in week 16 or not. But I said the same thing last week. If Walker plays, I think he's still startable. The matchup's not great here against the Vikings. And either way, Zach Charbonnet is startable. You want to start Charbs if he's the RB1. If Walker's active, I still think he may get some volume and be startable. But their ceiling is definitely lowered because this Minnesota Vikings run defense is no joke whatsoever. So I don't know that they're my favorite starts this week. And yes, I kind of prefer if Walker's healthy, just roll with Walker. If Walker's not healthy, just roll with Charbs. But nonetheless, they're startable. We'll just leave it at that going into week 16. Next up, we have the Jaguars, who are going to travel to face the Raiders. And listen, I got ETN as a sit. I got Bigsby as a sit. I don't know what this offense is, but apparently Mac Jones is not that bad, although he was awful in week 14. Was not that bad this past week, although he did throw 2 picks. He also threw 294 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, had 29 yards on the ground. Bigsby had 4.2 fantasy points. ETN had 12.5. So the difference was ETN had double digits in week 14, but did it all through the passing game. This past week, he was not that bad on the ground, 4.6 yards per carry, 65 rushing yards, and 4 catches for 20 receiving yards. And Bigsby did have 11 touches for 42 yards on the ground, but no touchdown like he had in week 14. So, I mean, I just don't trust these running backs. Yes, if you're desperate, if there's nothing there, it's a good matchup. Sure. If you got to start one of these guys, may the fantasy gods be with you. But do I want to start either Jaguars running back this week? Do I want you to start them? No. But if you're desperate, sure. They're getting some volume. This offense has been better than expected with Mac Jones at quarterback. I'll just leave it at that. But obviously, I don't prefer either running back this week. Sincere McCormick. Once again, I'm recording this before Monday Night Football. I'm not expecting a ton against Atlanta. Their run defense has been pretty good. But I want to make a bold claim. If McCormick gets the majority of the touches in Week 15, then I'm going to view him as startable in Week 16 and 17 against the Jaguars and the Saints, 2 bottom 5 run defenses, and fantasy points allowed to running backs. We'll see what happens on Monday Night Football. Alexander Mattison is the backup, according to coaches, going into Week 15. Never trust coaches. Zamir White is out, and Amir Abdullah has taken the backseat as the RB3 here. So I don't so much care about the final points for Sincere McCormick. I care about the total touches. And if he gets the bulk of the touches, then I will roll with him in Week 16 and 17 as a start against these bad run defenses. McCormick might just save your fantasy season. We'll find out. Anybody else here, just a big old question mark. Is Madison going to play this week? I guess so, because he's playing in Week 15. Is White going to play? I don't know. Amir Abdullah, no relevancy here as McCormick's taking that over. But the coaching staff is backing McCormick. He's got good matchups. He's 49% rostered. He might be a guy to wrap up the fantasy season. Next up, we got the Niners, who are traveling to face the Dolphins. And boy, oh boy, what is the Niners offense? I don't know, but Isaac Arando was okay in that Thursday night matchup against the Rams. He had 11.5 fantasy points, 57 yards on the ground, 4 catches for 18 receiving yards. So he's startable. He's the guy. He was healthy. The foot sprain didn't seem to bother him. So you can start him. But do I prefer it? No, because I don't know. What is this offense? Like, everyone was bad this past week except for Garando and Kittle, I guess. And I just don't. I mean, I just don't think there's any real upside. I'm trying to stay away here. Patrick Taylor was not a thing on the field for 6% of snaps. 0 touches, 0 fantasy points. Anybody else here at running back just said, and Garando, certainly not my favorite going into the week. Devon Achane remains a start. He's had double digits every game since week 7, every game on the season except for 3. And those 3 games, Tua was not the quarterback, right? So 14.6 this past week, 41 yards on the ground, 7 targets, 7 receptions, 35 receiving yards. Whether he scores a touchdown or just gets the receptions or whatever, he's going to find a way to get it done. He remains a must-start running back. Not the best matchup here, but I'm not scared of this Niners defense. And actually, it is a good matchup. I'm sorry. They've fallen back in terms of their rankings against running backs. So, A-Chain, you got him. About as solid of a start as you're going to get in Week 16. And next up, we're going to have the Buccaneers, who are traveling to face the Cowboys. Let's start with Bucky Irving, who gave me a lot of anxiety going into Week 15. Hip injury, fresh back injury, did not matter. He was good to go. 15 touches, 117 rushing yards, 7.8 yards per carry. That is the 3rd time this season Bucky's had over 7 yards per carry. He did have 2 catches, but -4 receiving yards. He was just missing the touchdown in this game. But nonetheless, Bucky was great against a good Chargers run defense in Week 15. And now he gets a bottom 5 run defense in the Cowboys and the Bucs. They're going to try to be winning every single game to make sure they secure the NFC South. They're not going to take their foot off the gas. Keep rolling with Bucky Irving. He's going to be a great start this week. And I keep saying it, but Rachaad White is still a good start as well. And he had 14.1 fantasy points this past week. He himself had 4.27 yards per carry. He's had 4.2 or more yards per carry in his last 3 games with a ceiling of 6.9. yards per carry for all you Rachaad White haters who say he's not efficient. 64 yards on the ground, 2 catches for 17 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. So Rachaad White still very startable. Bucky Irving, Rachaad White. They get Dallas this week, then Carolina the following week. 2 very soft run defenses. If you play through week 18, they get the Saints in week 18. Their starts for the rest of the fantasy season unless they are hurt. Sean Tucker, not enough there. He did have 7 touches this past week, but 1.7 fantasy points. He's a sit. Rico Dowdle, moving on to the Cowboys, has been fantastic, though. 14.9 fantasy points this past week, 149 yards on the ground. That was it. No receptions, no targets, no touchdowns. Good matchup, right? But he's just been really efficient. 4.5 or more yards per carry in each of his last 4 games with a ceiling of 7.2 yards per carry. It's his backfield. We don't need to worry about crusty, dusty Zeke, although he did get some involvement this past week. Shout out to Zeke. He had 9 touches and 1 target, 1 catch. But yeah, nobody's taking this away from Rico. It's not the greatest matchup, not the worst against the Bucs, but if you own him, the volume's there. He's been efficient. Keep rolling with Rico Dowdle. Good start in week 16. All right, let's move along to the final game of the week on Monday Night Football. We're going to have the Saints, who are traveling to face the Packers. So Alvin Kamara, I think, is going to be a huge conundrum here in week 16 for fantasy managers. I might be wrong on this, but I think we're going to be going back and forth all week. Is he starting? Is he questionable? How many practices has he had? Nursing a groin injury. This is a tough one. It's not the best matchup, not the worst matchup. And like I said, I don't think we're going to know till late in the week whether Kamara is playing this week or not. 17 fantasy points this past week, and I told you guys, you own Kamara, you still got to start him. I know it's Jake Haener at quarterback, and then Haener got benched anyways, and Spencer Rattler came in, but Kamara's just that guy. Makes a big play, scores a touchdown. Wasn't very efficient on the ground. The offense wasn't very good, but they hung in there with the Commanders at home. And he had 17 fantasy points. He has double digits in every game this season except for 1. So, yeah, if Kamara plays this week, I think you should start him. And I just got to leave it at that until we get a further update on the injury. The issue is Kendre Miller's been getting touches. He's been looking okay, 5.1 yards per carry this past week. The week before that, he scored a touchdown. Saints are playing for nothing. Are they going to risk Kamara's long-term health? Does Kamara want to risk his long-term health? Does he want to play? There's a lot of questions here. If Kendre Miller ends up being the RB1, I think he's startable in a desperation sense, but that's it. If Kendre Miller is the RB2, I don't want to start him. So, big old question mark when it comes to the Saints at this point in the week. We'll find out as the week progresses. Then we got Josh Jacobs, who is playing out of his mind. If you guys remember weeks ago, Josh Jacobs was one of my top targets in terms of league-winning trade candidates, and he has absolutely been fantastic since coming off the bye week. And I mean, he was great before that too, but since the week 10 bye, he has 21.6 or more fantasy points in every single game. In that stretch, he has had 9 rushing touchdowns. Touchdown this past week, 94 yards on the ground, 4 catches for 42 receiving yards. And the Saints have an awful run defense. So if you own Josh Jacobs, there's no question here. You're starting Josh Jacobs in week 16. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single matchup, every single running back, and who you should be starting, who you should be sitting going in to week 16, the second round of the 2024 fantasy football playoffs. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into the week, please drop me a comment. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I can. Look out for our live fantasy Q&A live streams on Tuesday night and Saturday night this week as well for your guys' fantasy questions. But most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel because we're going to have everything you guys could possibly need as the fantasy season starts to wrap up to help you guys dominate the rest of the 2024 fantasy football season. So make sure you are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the videos. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.